This is a continuation of a thematic presentation of the Bhagavad Gita. The previous session we focused on chapter 1 and we derived a theme of suffering. We explored the nature of human suffering. We explored the distinction between pain and suffering. We also established the difference. And we also looked at ways and means to leverage pain for us to be able to use pain as a platform to be able to rise higher. Now, as we continue the series, we derive a very prominent theme from the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, and it has to do with a crisis. Previously, when we looked at suffering, we didn't speak so much about the nature of suffering or why was there any suffering in the personalities who were involved in the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Even before the battle began, why was there such inaction? We looked at some verses from the Bhagavad Gita where the main, one of the main actors of the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Arjun, the prominent general and the extraordinarily close friend and devotee of the Lord, was actually put into inaction because of the extent of mental suffering that he went through. So we didn't really go deeper into the cause of suffering. And a very prominent theme that emerges from the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is the actual cause of suffering, which is extraordinarily relevant to us. The Bhagavad Gita is as relevant to us today, and the circumstances are as relevant today as they were 5,000 years back, and this would remain relevant as long as a human being exists on the planet. Now let's go a little deeper and understand and explore the causes of suffering. So the theme today is our identity crisis. In one level or one oversimplified manner of talking about the Bhagavad Gita, one can reach a conclusion that the Bhagavad Gita is a solution to an identity crisis. But let's understand the meaning of an identity crisis. Let's understand what exactly happens before we tend to act. We ended the previous session saying Arjuna was immobilized. He was not able to act, even though he knew his duty was to take up arms against evil. His duty was to take up arms to protect the righteous. He could not act. He was immobilized because he was extraordinarily confused and he had to lay down his arms and he had to have a session of back and forth dialogue between him and the Lord for him to be able to even act. So what happens before we act? And why was Arjuna confused? Let's take a look at the fundamentals of action before we go deeper. Any action, before we act, any action is predetermined and it is fully influenced by establishing an identity. Before I act as the father to my child, I establish the identity that I'm a parent. Only being a parent and being a father allows me to act with her and speak to her, my daughter, in a certain way. Being a husband allows me to interact with my wife in a certain manner. First, I establish an identity, and only then am I able to initiate appropriate action within the boundaries set forth by such an identity. Let's understand that very, very clearly, that we cannot act unless we establish an identity. Similarly, if one were to take the professional environment into consideration, we look at our superiors, we look at our boss, we understand his boss, we understand superiors in the organization, and we act as subordinates by assuming the identity of a subordinate. Have you noticed that in the workplace, the mere removing of a title can completely make someone inactive? This is a very political ploy employed in many corporate houses where they put people in a corner. They remove them and deprive them of a title. In most cases, they are called strategists. And strategy generally means that they are not going to be involving themselves in tactics. They are not going to be involving themselves in day-to-day operations. They are relegated to the thinking part of the organization, which essentially means that he has been sidelined or she has been sidelined. This is a very clear tactic because they are removing such a person from a certain identity which others assume when they even interact with such a person. If your boss is deprived of his position of being a manager, an operational manager, or someone who is taking care of the day-to-day affairs of the company, and you will not look at him as a superior. You look at him as a superior, but he would not influence your thoughts and actions. You would look at his replacement, and only then would you act. So we understand that there needs to be an identity that needs to be established, and once we establish such an identity, we are able to act. And if we are confused about the identity that's being established, it results in confusing action, it results in conflicts. So we have to be very careful in understanding that before an action takes place, you have an identity in place. Please understand that. Okay? So before we act, we need an identity. And the real crisis, the mother of all crises, the bigger crisis that we face, is that we all have multiple identities. For instance, if you look at it very fundamentally to have a basic understanding, I, for example, am a parent, I'm a professional, I do have a certain duty, I perform certain actions, I'm viewed as a professional, and I'm also a parent, and over and above all of that, you are now interacting with me as I perform on the basis of my spiritual identity. Now I have three different identities. While I sit here, I have a spiritual identity as a mentor, as someone who shares certain spiritual knowledge and has certain dialogues, and he's able to influence people in certain ways based on spiritual knowledge. This is an identity. Now, this does not remove the fact that I'm a parent. That's a different identity. And then it does not remove the fact that for most part of the week, I'm also a professional. I'm executing certain services in certain industries. So now you have fundamentally three different identities. You are a professional, you are a parent, and you also have a spiritual core. So these multiple identities are very interesting. They exist, and we have to learn to distinguish them. It's very important for us to be able to understand that they are very distinct identities. Even though it might seem very obvious, sometimes it overlaps and it's very confusing as to which one is more prominent. So we have to understand that these are very, very distinct identities. Now, why is there a crisis? I called and I titled this slide, The Mother of All Crises. And the reason why I'm calling the mother of all crises is if action is what leads to trouble. For instance, in the previous session, we spoke of the past action influencing the present action influencing the future, the past action increasing or decreasing the intensity of our suffering, the present action having the ability to impact our suffering. If action is going to be the core of all forms of impressions on our consciousness, all forms of suffering and happiness and so on and so forth, and if action is going to be preceded by assuming an identity, then the mother of all crises and the greatest challenge faced by most is due to conflicting identities. We all have conflicting identities, and it brings forth immense stress. When you wake up in the morning, you have the priority of being a parent, you have to prioritize being a professional, you have to prioritize being a spiritualist, you have to prioritize being a member of society, so on and so forth. Now these are conflicting identities, and they bring forth immense stress because you're trying to prioritize and you're trying to juggle the same 24 hours and 7 days amongst the different identities, and in most cases it results in a huge conflict. They're overlapping situations. Or one dominates and the other suffers. As a consequence, we have inefficiencies. We are extraordinarily inefficient. We don't act in our full capacity because one identity dominates over the other. Someone is seen as a good parent, but they may not be seen as a good professional. Someone could be seen as a good professional, they are not seen as a good parent. Someone is seen as a good professional and a good parent, but they have absolutely no spiritual basis for their existence. They just exist on a day-to-day basis, taking care of the body, taking care of the body of those who are with them and who they call family. So there are great inefficiencies where human potential is completely lost because one has not understood that there is a conflict. One has not understood that there's an underlying crisis. One has not understood the basis of all action is identity. And one has not understood how to manage their identities. So there are great inefficiencies, which essentially means that there's great scope for improvement. So there's great hope. So crisis occurs due to our inability to manage and prioritize our actions that are driven by the various identities we assume. It's a real crisis. Someone faces a spiritual crisis. Someone faces a parenting crisis. Someone faces a professional crisis. And all of these are because one identity dominates over the other, and as a consequence, someone is losing out. And it surely would result in a crisis. Sometimes the person is so active trying to manage and balance all the priorities and the different identities they've assumed, they neglect their health. And sooner or later, at some point, the health starts giving in, and they're forced to focus on their body at a time when the demands on them are extraordinarily high. So, the mother of all crises rests in the fact that we have multiple identities which are a fact of life, and we face immense stress in being able to manage, streamline, and prioritize our actions, which are fundamentally based on our assuming our identities. Now, let's just talk a little bit about Arjuna's dilemma. Arjuna, on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, was an extraordinarily focused general. In fact, a story which comes to our mind is when he was being trained by his guru, by his spiritual master, Dronacharya. He was being trained in the art of archery. Those days, the princes and those who belonged to the royal families were all sent away to what is called the ashram, which is the school of the guru, and this was normally situated further away from cities. It was in the forest, and a royal disciple was often given training in weaponry. He was given training in the political sciences. He was also given training in economics and so on and so forth. So by the time they came back, they were very well situated for them to be able to take on the royal duties that had to be chosen by them. So Arjuna, while he was in such a school, was asked to identify a target. So his teacher put a bird in a tree which was filled with foliage. It was a very green tree, and there was a parrot. It was a plastic, it was not plastic. I'm sorry, plastic didn't exist. It was actually a toy. It was a toy parrot which was put up on the tree, which was also colored green, amongst green leaves, and it was a huge tree. And the guru asked his many disciples to identify the target. One of them said, he asked them, "What do you see?" And they said, "I see a tree, and I see a forest surrounding the tree, and in the tree I see a parrot." The other said, "I see a tree, and I see a parrot." And then Arjuna was asked, "What do you see in identifying the target?" And he was able to identify the target, where he said, "All I can see is the eye of the parrot." So this was a person who had such immense focus and had the ability to focus his mind and be able to lock his mind on, concentrate on a singular target. He had a laser-like focus. But this personality with a laser-like focus was reduced to nothing on the battlefield of Kurukshetra 5,000 years back. And his inaction and his inability to act was predominantly because he was undergoing a crisis. His crisis was similar to our crisis, which immobilized him. And sometimes it can immobilize us, it can make us inefficient. He became extraordinarily inefficient. He dropped his arms right in front of the enemy, and this was equal to being dead those days, or even today. For instance, any warrior who goes to battle, if he were to drop his arms before his enemy and he were to sit down, being a pacifist in the battlefield is considered to be cowardice. Right? He is not considered to be so wonderful. It is not such a wonderful trait. In those days, it was extraordinarily important because everything was based on honor. And Arjuna just dropped his bows, he dropped all his weapons and sat down. He was immobilized because he had an identity crisis. And the identity crisis was that on the opposite side, the side where he had to take up arms against, were his cousins. His grandfather, Bhishma, was also a part of the opposition. His guru was also a part of the opposition. Now you have someone who has a relationship with his cousins. He is a grandson to his grandfather, a very loving, deep relationship between the grandfather and the grandson. And he was also the best disciple of his guru, where there was a very intimate relationship between him and his guru Dronacharya. In fact, to the point where Arjuna never ever thought of any other identity other than being a disciple of his guru. That was so important. But now the guru was on the opposite side, taking up arms against him. And as a matter of duty, Arjuna was forced to pick up arms against all these people who would normally be considered loving family members and well-wishers. Now he had to choose between being a cousin, being a grandson, being a disciple, because all these relationships and identities were stacked high against him on the opposite side of the battlefield, or being a duty-bound devotee and intimate friend of the Lord. He had to choose between these two identities. He was in a huge identity crisis 5,000 years back because he had to pick up arms. This was not a matter of getting up in the morning and us choosing, whether we have to go first and take care of, an activity related to our office. Do we have to take care of an activity that is related to the home? Do we have to take care of activity that is related to the core of our existence, which is our activity of our spiritual well-being? It was not a situation like that. It was not a battle of, very somewhat insignificant aspects. This was a situation where he really had to pick up arms against those who were opposing him, and it was a crisis in his identities. So he really had to choose, because for him, his choice of the identity would force him to act. He had to act. Now, looking at the battlefield and looking at his cousins and looking at his grandfather, looking at his guru, he was not able to act. And as a consequence, he was not able to act, and as a consequence, the crisis immobilized him. Right? So again, we are determining and understanding that Arjuna's dilemma was actually an identity crisis. It was a crisis of epic proportions. It was not ordinary. He had to choose between inaction and not being able to perform his duty of being able to offer protection to the righteous, or shooting arrows and taking up armed conflict with his own family members. So again, the crisis was based on his identity. He would either be able to act or not act. Now, we spoke of the conflict. We said Arjuna had to choose between being a cousin to the Kauravas, being a grandson to Bhishma, being a disciple to Dronacharya, or being a devotee and intimate friend of the Lord. Why was the Lord wanting him to take up arms against his own family members? We have spoken about it in the past. His family members were turning against the righteous and being able to move human society forward. And he had to protect the righteous, and he had to protect truth, and he had to choose between the two. So the Lord being with him was actually guiding him to pick up arms and fight and perform his duty, immaterial of who is in front of him. If the enemy is opposing righteousness, the enemy, no matter immaterial of who they are, being a Kshatriya, being a warrior, his duty was to take up arms against them and offer protection to the righteous. So the root cause of his intense suffering was due to an identity crisis. We just want to bring forth the fact that there was an identity crisis which Arjuna was facing. The entire dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita between Arjuna and Krishna was to resolve this identity crisis and propel him forward, and for him to be able to establish a proper identity. So now let's look at the solution. We see a picture of a lotus, and in the lotus we see several layers and several different petals. Each petal, as we peel a lotus, if any of you had an experience of peeling a lotus, it opens up and there are multiple layers. Similarly, we have multiple identities, and as we peel each and every layer, it becomes more and more intimate. But we reach a point where we cannot peel anymore, and at that point we realize that we have a core identity. It is a spiritual identity. It is the identity of being related to the Lord. Let's assume that one of the outer lotus petals is a relationship with the workplace. As we come a little closer, it could possibly be a relationship with our cousins and family members. As we come a little closer, it's a relationship with our immediate family. As we come really close and come to the point where we cannot peel the lotus petal any further, then that relationship is a spiritual relationship that is an intimate relationship, and it is the core of all identities, which is a relationship with the Lord. So the solution for us to be able to move forward and resolve an identity crisis lies in establishing a spiritual identity and allowing the core identity to dominate. We have to allow the core identity to dominate. That is the solution. Prioritizing action based on the core identity relieves stress. Now, how do we act on a professional level establishing the core identity? That's a matter which is going to be discussed further. We just want to establish the fact that the core identity, which is spiritual, being established would relieve stress. Reaching and acting in the interests of the spiritual identity is the sole objective of any bona fide spiritual path. If you belong to a religion, the only purpose of being in part of a religion is for us to be able to finally understand who we are, for us to be able to understand and establish an identity, which is the core identity of who we are, being able to understand the specific relationship of who is God and our relationship with Him, and being able to act upon the relationship. Because you cannot act properly till you establish a relationship. You cannot establish a relationship until you assume an identity. It's all connected. And the sole objective of any path which claims that it is God-centered, the sole objective is for us to be able to understand who we are, understand who the Lord is, for us to be able to establish a relationship, and for us to be able to act on the relationship. The Bhagavad Gita resolves the identity crisis and provides a very systematic approach to resolving this issue. The real solution in the Bhagavad Gita, the entire dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita, the various systems and philosophies that are being propounded, and different areas and different ways to reach the Lord, all of which is being provided purely for us to be able to establish the core identity, for us to be able to establish the identity, and for us to be able to act upon it, and for us to be able to prioritize and be able to allow the core identity to dominate. This is the whole purpose of the Bhagavad Gita. In reality, beginning to end, we see different dimensions come about, but in reality, we are resolving this issue. We have to have this understanding as we go deeper. We have to have the understanding that we are trying to resolve an identity crisis. We face an identity crisis each day, each year of our lives. And it is very important for us to be able to establish a core identity. And it's very important for us to be able to act upon that core identity and be able to prioritize our life according to the needs of the core identity. Right? Sometimes we move, and we move for the purpose of educating our children. We believe that relocating to a different city would help because there's a university, there's a better schooling, so on and so forth. Sometimes we move based on our own needs. Right? I'm just giving you an example. Now, the next choice that we would want to make is probably when we try and question ourselves, for example, as to whether we should move to a certain city, we would probably want to see if it is going to be convenient for us to be able to continue to nourish our spiritual identity. Are we capable of nourishing our spiritual identity in that new location? Are we able to have the association of similar practitioners? Whatever it is that you do you have others who also do it? Because that's going to be very, very important for us to be able to move forward. Do you have a system, for instance, if you're going to be changing your workplace, you have to try and examine the change in the workplace based on your core identity of wanting to be a spiritualist. If I'm going to be changing from one job to the other, will it impact my other identities? Will I be able to be a proper spiritualist? Will I be able to be a proper father, husband, so on and so forth? You have to examine decisions first based on the core identity, because the core identity is going to lead to actions. Actions is going to determine whether you're going to be happy or unhappy. So if you're seeking bliss, you better make sure that the core identity of spiritual activity is maintained in a very high tempo. Because if 80% of your happiness is going to depend on the spiritual identity, and let's assume that 20% is based on the other identities that you've established, for instance, the identity of being a parent, a professional, and so on and so forth, then 80% of your identity being spiritual would result in 80% of your activities being spent and time being spent in spiritual activities. This would allow you to manage your life better. You would be able to manage stress better. Because the economic situation and even the frailties and the changes that occur in life in general ensure that depending on any other identity, be it being a parent or a professional and so on and so forth, being a spouse, all of these identities could one day or the other undermine our ability to experience happiness. There's a tremendous amount of fluctuation. It's always in a state of flux. That's exactly how it's designed. The only thing that doesn't change is the core identity. The core identity of having a relationship with the Lord does not change. Activities that are related to the core identity can be maintained under all circumstances. And if we cultivate such a core identity and we start prioritizing life based on the core identity, we would have the ability to maintain a stress-free life. This is the solution to the mother of all crises. We have to work on establishing an identity which is the core and learn to live around the core as opposed to deprioritizing it. We have to place the Lord in the center and move every other identity to the periphery. Currently, every other identity dominates. And it has the ability to dominate. Your professional life dominates over your parenting dominates over being a spouse, and being a spouse could dominate over, your spiritual activity and so on and so forth. This constant domination of one identity over the other causes immense stress. And as a course of life, we completely neglect the core. As opposed to keeping the Lord in the periphery, we bring the Lord right to the center and we establish a core identity. We keep every other identity in line with the core identity. Every petal of the lotus is important. Every petal. We cannot minimize the outer petals, neither can we say that the outer petals are as important as the core. Every petal is important, so we are not trying to minimize that. But at the same time, what we are trying to say is establish the importance based on the relationship with the center. Understand that right in the center is our relationship with the Lord, and every other petal in the lotus is fundamentally has to derive its nourishment from our relationship with the Lord. So this is a matter of yoga, union with the Lord. Yoga is derived from the word yuti, and it's all based on how we are going to interact with this core identity of being a servant of the Lord. And that is going to be discussed in greater detail as we progress further. In the subsequent sessions, we will be working on showing and how fragmented our existence is. We would want to look at how fragmented our whole perceptions are. Because we derive information from different sources, we have a tendency to be extraordinarily fragmented. And someone who is very fragmented, who is not wholesome, cannot be happy. We're going to be examining those subsequently, and we will end our session here. It was a short session, so we want to quickly summarize. The first thing that we spoke of is that the theme that is very prominent in the first chapter is of suffering. And from suffering, we went to the next step of identifying the cause of suffering. The real cause of suffering is because we have an identity crisis. We said this is the mother of all crises. It's the identity crisis. We first spoke of what is an identity. We said that an identity is a certain, it's a certain tag. And the identity becomes a precursor to all actions. One has to assume the identity of a parent for them to be able to deal with someone in the level of a parent. One has to assume the identity of a spouse for them to be able to deal with someone on the level of a spouse. One has to become a professional and he has to deal with other professionals in that identity of a professional. So we take subordinate or superior positions based on different identities. So our action is going to be based on identities, and that is a core fact. It's a fact. And then we looked at the fact that we have a real crisis because we all have multiple identities. And one identity tends to dominate over the other. And then we looked at the fact that Arjuna's dilemma 5,000 years back was also an identity crisis. He had to choose between the different identities, and he had to choose between being a cousin, being a father. I'm sorry, being a cousin, being a disciple, being a grandson, versus acting on the path of duty set forth by the Lord Himself. And this actually posed an extraordinary conflict and stress to the extent that he became inactive. Inaction resulted because he had an identity crisis. He simply didn't know how to act. What should I act on? What should I base my action on? So we also proposed a solution saying that there can never ever be a wholesome solution or happiness if we were to act on individual identities that are disconnected or not aligned with the core. So we spoke of the fact that we have to establish a core identity. We have to establish a spiritual identity. If you don't have one, that's your primary task. The whole Bhagavad Gita, the whole purpose, for example, the sole objective of all forms of religion, all forms of spirituality, if they are bona fide, is for them to be able to establish the core identity, establish the relationship between the Lord and the person, and for us to be able to act in such a relationship. This is the whole purpose of any body of religious knowledge. And if this is not being done in religion, then that does not form a bona fide path. You should reject it. If you cannot identify the fact that a certain religion allows you to develop a relationship with the Lord, a certain religion allows you to establish a spiritual identity, allows you to move forward in such a relationship and act on such a relationship, then that religion is not bona fide. That inconsistency should be observed and you should reject it. The Bhagavad Gita resolves the identity crisis. The whole dialogue between Krishna, the Lord, and Arjuna, his disciple, his devotee, and the other participant in the dialogue was to resolve the identity crisis. And the approach given by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita is as relevant today as it was 5,000 years back. We're going to examine the different approaches to resolve the identity crisis. The entire Bhagavad Gita is about processes and methods for us to be able to establish a spiritual identity and execute action based on that. So we'll look into those as we take on further sessions. Thank you very much for listening.